So I've been talking about your cause, I guess, since you started your videos and since you started having troubles with, with human rights tribunals or threats by U of T. And I just think it's common sense, as I said, that I think that promoting critical thinking, helping people to be able to tolerate subjects that they may not feel comfortable about, but that they should be able to hear and process, not based on emotions, but based on an actual analysis of the facts, the evidence, the reality, versus some agenda being shoved down their throat, whether it's through the media, through the professors, and anyone teaching in academia knows that there are professors who have no problem with basically teaching their truths as fact. And so I've been promoting this. I've been promoting it within my own organization, the Ontario Psychological Association. I got a lot of flack from other psychologists who thought, no, we can't allow this type of speech to happen. That discussion that you're supposed to have had, the travesty really, it was October, I believe, when you had those other professors coming in and talking about the issue. Yeah. Some psychologists wrote pieces in national media publications saying this kind of discussion should not happen.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and this is from psychologists, the ones who are supposed to be best trained to be able to tolerate the discomfort that goes along with discussing uncomfortable topics. So I was hoping for you to be able to share with the audience your experience in the last few months in trying to promote this, what you're basically trying to promote, which I think I'll let you describe in your own words.
Okay. So let me think about those videos for a minute. Well, I think there were two things that, I should give you some background on the videos, I guess. I mean, I just made them in my office at home. I had no idea what the consequence would be. I was just trying to sort out my thoughts partly about not so much Bill C-16 as the background policies that surround it, especially on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website. Because the bill itself looks rather innocuous. It's only about 2 paragraphs long. The only part of it that isn't innocuous is the insistence on transforming the hate speech codes, including harassment and discrimination based on gender identity and gender expression in the hate speech codes. I thought that's weird. There's something up there. Anyways, I started digging more into the background on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website, and the policies surrounding Bill C-16, to call them appalling is barely to scratch the surface. They're unbelievably badly written and internally contradictory and over-inclusive and dangerous. And I mean, they do things, for example, like make employers responsible for all the speech acts of their employees, whether they have intended or unintended consequences. That's completely... The only reason you would write a law like that is to get as many employers in trouble as you could possibly manage, because there's no other reason for formulating the legislation that way. And a colleague of mine came in recently at the university, and he's starting to teach a little bit about the background for this sort of thing in one of his classes. And he showed me the developmental progression of the policies surrounding Bill C-16. And originally they were written in a tighter format, but then they were farmed out for what they called public consultation, which basically meant they ran them by a variety of people who I would say are very strongly on the activist end of the political spectrum. And they basically, in order to not bother anyone who they had consulted with, they decided, for example, that gender identity should be nothing but subjective choice, which is, I don't even know what to say about that. If you're a psychologist and you have any sense at all, that's a completely insane proposition. It's, first of all, predicated on the idea that your identity is your subjective choice. And that's never been the case for any sort of identity anywhere. You take your identity is twofold. The first thing that your identity is a functional set of tools to help you operate in the world. I mean, read Piaget, just scratch the surface of Piaget even, and you find out that, children start to construct their identities really when they're breastfeeding, because that's when you first start your social interactions. You start integrating your basic biological reflexes from a Piagetian perspective into something resembling a social relationship, because breastfeeding actually happens to be quite a complex act. And then you expand your developing identity out into the small microcosmic social world of the family, basically starting with your mother, but then you have siblings and your father and your relatives, conventionally speaking. And your identity is a negotiated game. And you're not the only one in charge of it by any stretch of the imagination at all. I mean, one of the things that Piaget pointed out was that between the ages of 2 and 4, and I think later research has really hammered this home, that even kids who are hyper-aggressive at 2, and there's a small proportion of them that are like that, learn to integrate their subjective desires into a broader social game and become socially acceptable to other children. And they do that through play. And what they're doing is playing their identity into being. And then once they're older than about 4 and they've become properly socialized so other children actually want to play with them, because that's the critical issue, it's the fundamental issue, then the peer community of children helps them bootstrap their identity up to something that will eventually approximate an adult identity. But that's functional. It has nothing to do with whim. It's a crazy idea. And then so partly your identity is the set of tools with which you function in the actual world, and part of it is a negotiated agreement with the other people around you. And that's all being taken out of the. That's all actually, as far as I can tell, that line of theorizing is technically illegal now in Ontario. And I'm not even talking about the potential biological basis of identity, because the idea that identity has no biological basis, that's just wrong. Like factually wrong. So, and we've written a social constructionist, we've written a radical social constructionist view of identity into the law. But even worse than that, we've gone beyond social constructionism, because Piaget was a constructionist, into just pure whim. Your identity can be at any moment what you assume that it's going to be. That's not a tenable solution. There's nothing about that proposition that's reasonable. So I was looking into this and I thought, this is just beyond comprehension, that we've written that idea into the policy surrounding Bill C-16. So I made that video. I was trying to sort that out and to figure out even what it meant. The terminology is messy in the extreme. First of all, with regards to gender identity is not a spectrum. It's a modified bimodal distribution. And if you're making law, you don't get to muck around with the words. You have to use the right words. And so it's a modified bimodal distribution, because almost everyone who has a biological identity of male or female identifies as male or female. It's 99.7%. And you could argue that that's a little tighter than it would be if society was more accepting of gender variation, let's say. But even if it went down to 99%, which would be an increase of what? Well, it would be almost an order of magnitude increase. You still have the overwhelming number of people whose gender identity matches their biological sex. And then you can stack on top of biological sex, gender identity, virtually perfect match. Then gender expression, almost everyone who is biologically male or female, who identifies as biologically male or female, expresses themselves as male or female. And then the vast majority of them have a sexual orientation that's in keeping with their, in traditional keeping with their biological sex, gender identity, and gender expression. So now we have a law that says those are independent. Guess what? That's not the definition of independence. And you can't just play mucky games with your legislative terminology. It gets people in trouble. So it's not a spectrum, and that's that. It's a modified bimodal distribution, and there are obviously exceptions, and I never argued once in the videos that I put out, despite how people reacted to them, that there weren't exceptions. Of course there are exceptions. And if you look at temperament, for example, the big differences between men and women are agreeableness and neuroticism. Fundamentally, women are about half a standard deviation more agreeable. That's compassion and politeness. And they're about half a standard deviation higher in negative emotion. And that's cross-cultural, by the way. And it also accounts for the reasons why women are about 3 to 4 times more likely to suffer cross-culturally from depression and anxiety, whereas men are more likely to be aggressive in prison and to drink. And low agreeableness is actually the best predictor of incarceration among men. Those are solid biological differences, but if you try to segregate men and women using only those 2 dimensions, you only get it right about 75% of the time. So there's a substantial overlap. But that still doesn't mean that it's not a spectrum. And the idea that there are no biological differences between men and women is such a preposterous claim that I can't even believe that we would ever have that discussion. I mean, men have wider jaws. Men are taller. They have broader shoulders. Women have more endurance in endurance sports. Women have a subcutaneous layer of fat. The shape is different. The way the arms are placed is different. The voice is different. And that's just gross morphology. I'm not even talking about genitalia. And then you can look at microstructures. There's differences between men and women at every level of the human microstructure, from the cellular all the way up to the social. So like, what in the world are we talking about? What's going on here? It's crazy. So that was video number 1. Video number 2 was the bloody Human Resources Department at the University of Toronto has adopted an equity position. Okay, so what equity means is that it doesn't mean equality of opportunity. It means equality of outcome. And that is, so this is the idea. The idea is that you take a social institution like a university, and then you look at the organization of that university at every single strata, from the executive level all the way down to the student level. Then what you do is you do an analysis of each level by community demography. Right? You get to define the demographic characteristics that you're going to discuss, however, which is actually a big problem. Then you make the presupposition that unless that organization at every level matches the demographic representation of people at every level, then it's corrupt, oppressive, and discriminatory, and it needs to be changed. Okay, so you think, well, what's wrong with that? Every level should have 50-50 men and women, let's say. It's like, you're really sure about that, are you? You're so sure about that. You don't think there's any natural differences in interest between men and women? Well, if you don't think so, then why are most psychology classes 80% women? And that differentiation is accelerating rapidly, like I've seen it over the course of my career, from maybe 60% men at the beginning of my career to like 80% women now. And men occupy more of the positions in the STEM fields, at least for now. It's the same in bloody Scandinavia. It's 20-to-1 nurses, 20-to-1 women to men nurses in Scandinavia, and 20-to-1 men to women in engineering. And that's in Scandinavia. And so what's happened in Scandinavia, as they've made the society more egalitarian in terms of its legal and social structures, is that the gender differences in personality between men and women have got bigger, not smaller. So what that means is that social constructionism isn't wrong. That's what it means. Wrong. Disproved. It's exactly the opposite of what the theory would have predicted, because the theory predicted, and God only knew how it was going to sort itself out. It's not like people knew this to begin with. The idea was that as you equalize the social structure, that the differences between men and women would disappear. Guess what? That didn't happen. And it's not studies of just a few hundred people in a few locations. Those are population-wide studies, and they've been replicated multiple times. So, and the funny thing is that, so there are temperamental differences between men and women. And neuroticism and agreeableness are not the only temperamental differences. So if you fragment extroversion, it fragments into assertiveness and gregariousness. Women are more gregarious, men are more assertive. If you fragment conscientiousness into orderliness and industriousness, women are more orderly and men are more industrious. If you fragment openness, which is the creativity dimension, into interest in ideas and interest in aesthetics, you find that women are more interested in aesthetics and men are more interested in ideas. So because you can fractionate the big 5 into 10, you get gender differences across all of them. And they're not trivial either. They make a difference. So, okay, so anyways, back to the equity thing of all the preposterous and idiotic ideas. So, first of all, to make gender equity across every dimension of an organization, you have to assume that men and women have identical interests and temperaments, and that if they don't, the state should intervene to bloody well ensure that they do, which is something for all you women to figure out, because now there's many positions in society that women preferentially occupy. So what are you going to do about that? And what are you going to do about the Asians? Because they occupy preferential positions as well. You know, they're overrepresented in all sorts of professional institutions. And the probability is that that's going to increase. What are you going to do about that? What about the Jews? What are you going to do about them? Because they're in the same position as the Asians. You're going to put quotas on all those people? What kind of stupidity is that? And then it's worse, too, because let's say you equalize women and just for the sake of argument, across all these different dimensions of society. Well, then what are you going to do? Are you going to equalize for black women and Latino women and Asian women? Are you going to subtype black women? Because it's not like they're all the same. Are you going to ensure that women from lower classes are represented just as much as women from upper classes? And how many generations back are you going to go to check that? What about intelligence? What about attractiveness? How about height? How about weight? So the problem with the fractionation by group identity is that it's endless. There's no way of ensuring equality across groups because there's an infinite number of groups. You can fragment group identity all the way down to the level of the individual, which is exactly what you should do, which is what we already did in the West. We figured, well, the ultimate diverse population is a population of individuals, so you let the individuals sort it out. No, we're going to replace that with group. Well, what that means for the bloody social activists is that they'll be able to play this game forever because you can continually fractionate group identity ad nauseum, and so the system will never be equal. And you can bloody well be sure that as we implement social policy to make sure that all outcomes are equal, that the amount of space that you personally are going to have to maneuver in is going to shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink. We've already seen that happen in many societies. You'd think we would have learned from the 20th century. So that's the equity issue. And then worse even, this is the HR and equity people, they're actually mucking about with people's unconscious biases. So this is what we want, right? We want your employers and the state to re-educate you so that your perceptions, because that's what we're talking about with regards to unconscious bias, so that your perceptions fall into accordance with their demands. And not even your voluntary perceptions. By the way, your involuntary, unconscious perceptions have to be retrained. Okay, so maybe that's not so good, especially when you look at that bloody implicit association test. Mahzarin Banaji from Harvard and Anthony Greenwald from the University of Washington. So Banaji is an avowed Marxist, and Greenwald and Banaji both bloody well know and have written that their implicit association test has neither the reliability nor the validity to be used as an individual diagnostic test. They know it.
Sorry, just jump in. I've lectured about that in my class, but not everyone is aware of that. Do you want to just give it? I can bring up a PowerPoint slide, or do you want to?
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Yeah.
Do you want to do that? Yeah, so I'll let you take over when you do that. So, despite the fact that...
Sorry, so forget all of it. It'll take a few minutes, so...
Yeah, well, despite the... Okay, so the implicit association test, in principle, is this word association game. It's actually predicated, I would say, on psychoanalytic ideas, most particularly on Jungian ideas, because Jung developed the association test many, many, many years ago. But it purports to investigate whether you are unconsciously biased towards one group or against another group. Could be gender, could be ethnicity, could be race, could be attractiveness, whatever. But the problem is that when you give the same person the damn IAT twice, they don't get the same results. So there's a rule for diagnostic tests. And the rule is the reliability, test-retest reliability, has to exceed something like 0.8 or 0.9. 0.8 at least. So the Big Five does that. IQ tests do that. But there's damn few tests that pass that reliability criteria. And the IAT is only reliable, I don't remember precisely, but I think it's about 0.5, which isn't even, it's not even near close enough to be used as a diagnostic test. Plus, it's not valid. So what does that mean? Well, let's say I assess your unconscious bias and give you a diagnosis. Well, there's no evidence that it predicts your behavior. So what good is it? What good is it? Well, it's good if you want people to send you to retraining exercises so that you can have your perceptions adjusted in the direction that your organization and the state thinks is proper. And that's happening everywhere. I got letters this week already for people at CBC. It's becoming mandatory there. St. Mike's Hospital, same thing. And they've decided that all of their micro institutions within the hospital will be equitable. There'll be 50% women and 50% men at every single level of the organization, or the organization is corrupt and oppressive. It's like, it's spreading so fast you can't believe it. I wrote Mahzarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald yesterday and sent it off to some of my colleagues saying, are you going to come out and make a public statement about the fact that your damn test is being used by pathological people for nefarious purposes? It's like, well, we'll see what they have to say about that. I was a bit more polite in my letter than that. But there's no excuse for it. There's absolutely no excuse for it. And as far as I'm concerned, it's part of the broader corruption of social psychology. You guys may know or may not that social psychology has been rife with controversy and scandal over the last 3 or 4 years. And a big part of the reason for that is it's damn corrupt discipline. And the use of the IAT for political reasons is a perfect example of that. There is no excuse for it. And the people at St. Mike's, they say, well, this is scientifically validated. It's like, no, it's not. And worse, let's say you do have unconscious bias, just for the sake of argument, and you could measure it reliably, which you can't, and then it was valid, which it isn't. Let's say all of those things were in case. There's no evidence whatsoever that those damn unconscious bias training programs, retraining programs, have the effect that they're supposed to have, and there's some evidence that they actually have the reverse effect. And maybe that's because people don't really like being marched off to re-education by their employers after they've been diagnosed as racist, even if there's no evidence that they in fact are. So it's an absolute misuse of psychology, and it's politically motivated. It's politically motivated. It's an assault on freedom. Anyways, I made those 2 videos, and I tried to take the HR and equity people at U of T to task because they made that training mandatory for their HR people. I thought, you don't have the right as an employer to invade the unconscious structures of your employees' minds and alter their political perspective, even though you can't do it. You don't have the right to do that, and to think about it as something you should do as a matter of course, as part of your ethical duty is... You really want that? You really want that? That's what you want your employers to be able to do? Figure out, independently of your behavior, whether or not you're a racist, or a classist, or a misogynist, or whatever that happens to be. And you really think that the bureaucrats at the university, for example, or bureaucrats anywhere for that matter, are actually capable and qualified of doing such a thing properly, without doing far more damage than any possible good? Well, so anyways, I made those 2 videos trying to sort this out and to investigate it, and then for whatever reason, the proverbial, well, you know what happened. Within 2 months, there was 180 newspaper articles written about it, and I don't know how many millions of people have watched these things online now, but it's plenty. And so what that also means is I put my finger on something, because who cares what a dim-witted professor from the University of Toronto does with his spare time at midnight? No one should care. I should have had my 15 minutes of notoriety, if that. But that isn't what happened. It was major news in Canada for 3 months, and I'm still talking to people all over the world about it. I get 100 letters a day, at least. I can't keep up with them. From people who are being cornered in all sorts of ways by their idiot employers and these safe space propositions at universities and the restrictions on their speech. They tell me constantly, well, I really agree with you, but I'm afraid to say anything about it. It's like, oh good, that's a wonderful position for us to be in, where people are afraid, they're afraid to speak their minds. What the hell? And it's not getting better. And if we don't do something about it, it's going to get a lot worse. You saw what happened at Berkeley. That's just a taste of what's to come. One day there's going to be an anti-FAS demonstration with a little bit of violence, and the bad guys on the other side are going to come out. And we're not going to like that very much. So maybe we should get our acts together and stop that from happening before it actually happens, unless that's what you want, and I wouldn't recommend it. We have a pretty sophisticated society, and it wouldn't take much to put a spanner into the spokes and flip everybody on their forehead. So, wake up, for Christ's sake. This is not good. And the fact that the bloody federal government has decided that they won't let people pick the judiciary anymore unless they take unconscious bias retraining. Right? What the hell? It's crazy. So, anyways, that's what happened.
In addition to, it's ideologically driven, just to that, do you think, and I'm always quite cynical, do you think it's also a make-work project for a bunch of people that they figure, we can create these tests that aren't valid, aren't reliable, but we've got an industry, that's going to keep going forever now.
Well, you'd never expect social psychologists to be careerists, would you? Yes, definitely. Well, it got out of hand, too. It's not, people don't necessarily plan these things. I'm sure that the Ontario Human Rights Commission, when they were talking about preferred pronoun use, had no idea whatsoever that, within 4 years of introducing the policies, that there would be 71 different gender identity categories. No one saw that coming. How could you possibly see that coming? And I don't think Banerjee and Greenwald had any idea that their test would be transformed into an implemented public policy so rapidly.
Right.
So,
okay, and just for those who are interested, the implicit associations or implicit attitudes test, my students, I always give a link to that, and if anyone's interested, I can give you a link where you can go to the test and actually do it yourself and find out. Because the assumption is that if you are implicitly racist, so explicitly racist, you would say, I hate blacks, let's say. Implicitly racist, oh no, some of my best friends are black. But when you do this test, the idea is that if you're shown a black person's face, okay, versus a white person's face, you're more likely to associate that black person with, let's say, violence. So you're basically being primed unconsciously. So when you see a black face, if you subsequently see a weapon, and you're asked to decide whether this is a weapon or a tool, you're more quickly going to say weapon, because you're already thinking dangerous, violence, weapons, because you have this negative association of blacks with weapons. And you'll do that faster than when you see a white face, because the white face should be more neutral. So whether you see after the white face a gun or a weapon, in theory, it should be about equal. It should take equal time to determine whether it is one or the other. Things like that. This is the kind of test that they do, and they've associated, or they've done this test, as Dr. Peterson said, with countless other types of constructs. And again, the reliability, the validity is it's not just suspect. It's non-existent. And as I said, if you'd like to try it out, if you're a student, check out on the Brightspace page. If you're not, email me, Facebook me, and I'll give you the link. And you can, they've done it to I think 50 different at least. Democrat, Republican, vanilla, strawberry. There's all these different things that you can do and see where your implicit or unconscious biases are. And as Dr. Peterson's saying, it's getting out of hand. And this whole idea with the gender pronouns, because during the debate that you had, or whatever that was, at the U of T, one of the people there, I think she was a lawyer, very condescendingly...
Costman.
Sorry?
Brenda Costman.
That's right. She's saying, oh, this kind of thing would never happen. You don't know what you're talking about. Well, first of all, on the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal page, they specifically say that you have to identify people by their preferred identity or expression, which includes pronoun usage. It's there on their page. It's not explicitly stated in Bill C-16, but the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, who will, in fact, enact any type of action against somebody who's violated these policies. Okay, it's on their very page. And I know you spoke about your own experience. I hope because not everyone saw the debate. Can you just talk about that part where, in speaking to other professionals who don't seem to be ideologically driven like Costman, what they said about the risk of this actually? This is so important.
Well, Costman was interesting. I mean, she's definitely not looking at this the same way that I do. But one of the things she said, in a rather condescending manner, was that I wouldn't be sent to jail even though I wanted to be. I'm paraphrasing, but that's roughly what she said. But that that the Human Rights Tribunal could take away my property and my wages and all of that. But that seemed to be okay for her as long as it didn't extend to jail. But that's also nonsense, because if you're found guilty by the Human Rights Tribunal and you don't pay, then that's contempt of court, and that goes to a different court, and then they put you in jail, and that's already happened. So it's crooked lawyer hand waving fundamentally, and it's an attempt to play down the significance of the law. You go online and read about the powers of the Human Rights Tribunal, and then see how safe you feel. So here's one of the things they can do. This is section 1.6. It's in a document about powers of the tribunals. They call them social justice tribunals in Ontario. They actually call them social justice tribunals. It's mind-boggling. They can suspend precedent, normal legal precedent, and jurisprudential tradition in the pursuit of their aims. It's actually documented as one of their powers. Think about that. Like, we live in a society that's essentially bound by the restrictions of English common law. And English common law is one of the most remarkable developments of civilization ever, period. Because in the English system, basically, the presupposition is that you have all the rights there are. They're not enumerated. You just have all of them, except when one of those rights imposes a restriction on someone else, and then they get irritated at you and take you to court. And then the judge sorts out who has which micro right, and then that's laid out as precedent. And so English common law is this tremendous body of evolved doctrine about how the infinite number of human rights that each individual has interacts with everyone else's rights. And like back when the first Trudeau brought in the Human Rights Code, the Bill of Rights, the Canadian Bill of Rights, there were lots of people who were upset by it because it's a different form of legal reasoning. The Bill of Rights says, here's the rights you have that the government is granting you. That's not how it works under the English Code. The English Code is, you have all the rights there are, and they're not given